The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
An historic agreement for U.S. soccer and equal pay.
Every player, man or woman, will be paid equally.
In 2022, the women's U.S. national soccer team won its legal battle for equal pay in a settlement with the U.S. Soccer Federation. It became the first women's national soccer team in the world to achieve the guarantee. The team's fight was just one of many in the last 60 years by women who say they have suffered wage discrimination since President Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Today we'll hear how far the country has come since Kennedy signed the landmark legislation, and just how far it still has to go in guaranteeing equal pay for equal work. All of that coming up next on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to this episode of JFK 35. 60 years ago, President Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act of 1963. In our last episode, we discussed the women who were behind the movement that brought the landmark legislation to JFK's desk. Today, we will follow it up to discuss how the act paved the way for other key anti-discrimination laws in the United States. Joining me now to discuss how far the United States has come and how far the country still has to go on the issue of equal pay is Andrea Johnson from the National Women's Law Center. Andrea, thank you for joining me today.
I'm thrilled to be here today.
Andrea, today we're here to talk about the Equal Pay Act, which was signed back in 1963 by President Kennedy. Just to start, how did the Equal Pay Act change things for women once it was signed? Did it change things?
It definitely has played an important role in narrowing the gender wage gap in this country. The Equal Pay Act really laid the groundwork for two other core non-discrimination laws that followed shortly thereafter. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that just a year later, and Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. And together, these laws vastly expanded opportunities for women and girls at work and in school. And we've really seen since the passage of the Equal Pay Act, women's labor force participation take off, just increased dramatically. In 1963, it was only 38% of adult women overall were in the labor force. And today that figure is 58%, which is a little bit lower than it was pre-pandemic. We know that a lot of women were forced out of the workforce during the pandemic, but still dramatically higher than 1963. And likewise, educational rates, 7% of women in 1963 were college graduates, but today that's over 39%. And women have just really started to enter professions that were previously closed to them, using Title VII to fight back against those barriers, against exclusionary policies and practices. And the Equal Pay Act specifically played an important role in ending the practice of employers using sex-segregated pay scales that very blatantly paid women at a lower rate than men doing the exact same job. So all of this has been really important to helping narrow the wage gap, but we still do have a pretty large wage gap in this country.
Explain that for folks who don't necessarily, maybe never lived with a segregated pay scale. Tell us a little bit about that policy and how widespread was that before the Equal Pay Act came in and made those policies illegal?
Yeah, it's pretty wild to think back to what job announcements used to look like in this country. It wasn't uncommon for a job announcement to specifically say women are paid at X rate, whereas men are paid at X rate more for doing the exact same job. This was not uncommon in factory work, and that's really kind of the origin of this concept of equal pay for equal work. Came from a lot of discussions around factory work, where there was just people on the line doing the same job, but men were paid a certain rate and women were paid a much lower rate, again, for doing the same job. And that's really the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act had that very much in mind when it was crafted, and it was effective at addressing those types of segregated pay rates and that kind of standardized work that we'd see in factories, but it's really not been able to keep up with the workplaces we have today.
And I want to get to that not keeping up, but before we get there, just to talk a little bit more, you mentioned Title VII and Title IX, which depending on people's experience, they may know a lot or a little about it. Can you talk a little bit about those two laws and what they were and how they work together with the Equal Pay Act to sort of set the foundation for what we know of women's equal pay rights today?
Yeah, Title VII is a very important piece of anti-discrimination law that makes it so that when you're going to work, you have the right to not be discriminated against in hiring, in the terms and conditions of your employment, in firing. And that covers not just sex, which the Equal Pay Act, it's important to realize, only covers sex. Title VII covers sex and race, national origin, and a number of other protected classes. So it is more expansive in that way than the Equal Pay Act. One thing to note, which might be getting a bit in the weeds here, but it's Title VII requires that you show intent to discriminate. That if somebody's saying, my employer discriminated against me, we need to show that they intended to do so. Whereas the Equal Pay Act, all you need to show is that you were doing the same job as a man and you were paid less. It doesn't need to show that the employer had any sort of, malice behind that, or really was paying you less because you're a woman. Just the simple fact of being paid less for doing the same job is enough under the Equal Pay Act. And so that's a really important role that the Equal Pay Act serves that's different from Title VII, but both are really important. Again, Title VII covers far more protected classes than just sex. And Title IX was very important in preventing sex discrimination in schools, and has played a massive role in women being able to fully participate, get a full education, to participate in sports in schools. And all of them work together to make a lot of progress. But I think we're really in a moment now of seeing how they just are not enough. And these laws need to be updated. They're quite old. And that's especially true of the Equal Pay Act.
So getting to that now, here we are 60 years later from the signing of the Equal Pay Act, and the statistics continue to show that women are still paid less than men on average for the same type of jobs. How have we, 60 years later, not been able, the Equal Pay Act's ideals was that women would be paid equally, but how is it that 60 years later we're still involved in trying to make that sort of ideal happen?
Right. So in 1963, women working full-time year-round were paid 59 cents for every dollar paid to a man. Today, the wage gap is 84 cents on the dollar paid to men. So definitely some progress, but it's not a lot of progress given that it's been 60 years. Also, it's important to realize that the wage gap has really been stagnant for the last 20 years, the last 2 decades. We haven't seen significant closure in the last 2 decades. And while we've seen women's educational attainment levels really skyrocket, labor force participation go up, the reality is that even as women increase their levels of education, years of experience, that's where we're seeing the wage gap widen. So the higher you move up in a job, the higher education you get, those women are often experiencing the widest wage gaps. So it's clear that we can't educate or work ourselves out of the wage gap. Something else is going on, and frankly, the Equal Pay Act isn't adequate to address it. And even President Kennedy recognized that when he signed the Equal Pay Act. He talked about it as just a first step and emphasized that much work remains to be done to achieve full equality of economic opportunity. So, there are a few things inherent in the Equal Pay Act that just make it inadequate to address the realities of today's workplaces. A big piece is that it was created to really address more standardized workplaces and these more sex segregated pay practices, which we don't see as much today. The pay discrimination we see in workplaces is far more hidden. Employers know not to be upfront about it. There's a lot of secrecy around pay, and that's really playing a major role in allowing discrimination to continue. Pay is set in a black box. It's really hard for anybody to know that they're being paid less than a man because just nobody knows what their pay is. That has been a big factor. And then the Equal Pay Act talks about equal pay for equal work. And again, equal work contemplated these standardized workplaces, which just is not the reality of a lot of work these days. Also, women are increasingly entering managerial and professional positions and at rates that just were not even contemplated, I think, back in 1963. And those jobs are not standardized. And so the Equal Pay Act has not been able to keep up with that. And I think that's why we see some of the larger wage gaps in these higher level positions. You have courts looking at equal pay for equal work and saying, in order for somebody to bring a claim under these laws, you have to be showing that a man doing the exact same job was paid more. And the exact same job, that means to the T sometimes based on the judge. So, it needs to be the same job title. It needs to be the exact same subject matter. And the reality is that so many, especially managerial positions, so many positions aren't exactly the same. So those cases are getting thrown out right away. And so the Equal Pay Act is just really not doing its job to address pay discrimination in so many of the positions that exist out in the world today.
So you're talking about that the Equal Pay Act really wasn't designed for today's workplace. What are some of the, I guess what some people call the donut holes, or the places where sort of the Equal Pay Act guarantees sort of there's holes in the system, and how can you plug those with either new legislation, or what kind of things are needed to sort of fill in those holes?
Yeah. So in addition to the fact that the equal pay for equal work standard has inherently in it this equal work standard that doesn't reflect the realities of today's far less standardized jobs, another shortcoming in the Equal Pay Act is that it doesn't cover race or national origin or other protected characteristics that we know lead to a lot of discrimination. It is only focused on sex, and sex in a very narrow way too. The act talks about you must pay equal pay for equal work, and cannot have disparate pay between people of the opposite sex. So again, it's considering just this very narrow sex binary. And that is a limitation. We especially see that as a limitation for women of color, who we know have some of the largest wage gaps. I mean, Black women, for example, in some states stand to lose over $1 million over their 40-year career to the wage gap. And that wage gap is due to the fact that they're experiencing discrimination based both on their sex and their race combined. And by just focusing on sex, the Equal Pay Act is really limited. And another thing that we're seeing, a loophole popping up with the Equal Pay Act, is that it's really easy for an employer to evade being held accountable. If an employee says, I've been paid unequal pay for equal work, an employer can say, sure, that's true, but there was another factor other than sex that justifies that pay gap. And that's a defense. This any factor other than sex defense is something that an employer can raise. And it's become a really big loophole whereby employers can point to things that seem neutral on their face. Like, for example, I relied on that job applicant's salary history to set pay. That does not mention sex anywhere in it. It seems like a neutral factor, just everybody's, past salary history. But we know that that is deeply tied to discrimination and discrimination in the market. The reality is that when an employer relies on an applicant's salary history to set the pay, that means that wage gaps are going to follow a woman from job to job, because women on average are paid less. So when employers rely on a salary history, and if a court allows that as a factor other than sex, which some have, that completely undermines the whole Equal Pay Act. So there's this kind of big target on its back that makes it very easy for an employer to evade liability and be able to continue to engage in practices that very clearly lead to women being paid less.
So what is the National Women's Law Center doing to try to address some of these issues in this 21st century, 2023 age? What can be done to try to raise that, minimize that, like eliminate that gap?
Yeah, we are working both at the federal level and in the states to try to strengthen our equal pay laws, because there is the Equal Pay Act at the federal level, but each state has their own equal pay law that can go beyond what the federal equal pay laws provides. And we're really seeing states take the lead on innovating in the space. I think state legislators are hearing from their constituents that they literally cannot afford to wait any longer for the wage gap to close. And so they're saying, what can we do? Like, let's get all the tools out there. And they have been passing laws through their states to close some of these loopholes that exist in their own state Equal Pay Act that are reflected in the federal Equal Pay Act, to make sure that an employer can't easily evade liability by just pointing to anything other than sex, to make sure that when jobs that aren't exactly identical, but that are definitely comparable, are fair comparisons. So somebody could say, I am a manager of a team and I am being paid, $20,000 less than Joe, who is managing a different team, but again, has the same, budget responsibility as me, same supervising responsibility as me, same authority as me. He is being paid significantly more, and that would be a fair comparison. So states are moving away from this equal pay for equal work standard to an equal pay for comparable work standard. And that has been incredibly important. And they're also including race and other protected characteristics in their equal pay laws, which is really important. And there is legislation pending in Congress, the Paycheck Fairness Act, that would address some of these loopholes as well. But I just want to emphasize how states and cities have really been leading in this space. And it's a very tangible and maybe more accessible way for people across the country to get involved and really make a change that could, very quickly impact their paycheck and their pocketbooks, because these laws are passing far more quickly than in Congress. And two exciting trends we're seeing in the state is really working to debias processes that employers use for setting pay. It's really hard to debias minds, but looking at processes that employers engage in to set pay is far more effective. So one example is prohibiting employers from relying on applicants' salary history to set pay. Since we know that if you use an applicant's salary history to set pay, that means that if women who on average are paid less, who might be leaving a job because they're being paid discriminatorily low wages and looking for a new opportunity, if you're always setting pay based on their past pay, you're just going to keep that discrimination perpetuating in those lower wages, condemning them to lower wages throughout their career. So 16 states have said, no, this is not okay. You cannot ask for rely on salary history. And that's really exciting. We see more states working on that this year. And also we're seeing this really amazing sort of revolution around pay transparency, recognizing that if we really want to make a difference in closing the wage gap, if we really want the Equal Pay Act to be able to sort of meet its full goals, we need to have more transparency around pay. We need employers saying, this is the salary range for this position. I'm putting it in the job announcement so we can have a more level negotiating playing field and avoid bias that tends to arise in negotiations. And also so employees just have that information so they can make sure that they are being paid fairly, and that employers have that level of accountability and knowing that they have to put that information out there publicly.
Do you think that's what it's going to take to really make the dream of the Equal Pay Act complete reality? Is some sort of pay transparency where people know? Because as you mentioned earlier on, like the secrecy is what gives sort of companies an edge and how they can pay or not pay someone. Do you think that's the major key?
Yes, I think we've really identified pay transparency as a leading tool for closing the wage gap. And I think other countries have kind of figured this out before us. Our country is very focused on a system where we address discrimination through complaints that employees have to bring after the fact, after the discrimination has happened. And that, I think, is a really important tool to have, but it cannot be the end. We really need to look proactively at making sure employers are doing the right thing to begin with. This all should not be on the back of the employee to stick their neck out there and say, I'm not being paid fairly. And especially when we can't find that out, that's really hard to have all the onus on the employee. The onus needs to be on the employer to be and making sure that they are setting pay fairly to begin with. And other countries have gotten at this by requiring employers to be more transparent about how they're setting pay, or even prove that they are setting pay fairly and that they are affirmatively following their country's equal pay laws. I think that shift is really important for our country to undertake, and that pay transparency is kind of a leading way to do that, to, again, really get the onus on the employer and to make sure that they are setting pay fairly to begin with.
Right. Well, my last question is just a little bit about the public consciousness of all this. We know that, for example, the women's soccer team, the women's national soccer team here in the U.S., and then also followed up by the Canadian national team, the women's teams had some major wins when it came to being paid an equal share to the men's teams. How do public sort of victories like that, do they help? Do they help bring awareness to the cause and to what you and people like you at the National Women's Law Center and elsewhere are doing to try to raise awareness about equal pay?
Definitely. It was very exciting to follow the U.S. women's soccer team and all the important advocacy they did for themselves, but really for everybody. I think the women's soccer team example was a very clear one for people about the ways and the very insidious ways that women are underpaid in this country, and all the ways that employers try to justify that, which, once you peel back a layer, you realize, no, actually, this is based on discrimination. This is based on stereotypes. This is based on just kind of assuming that women are worth less that we attract less interest in sports or less ticket sales, and that it's not okay to pay based on those stereotypical and discriminatory assumptions. So I think it was a really effective example that heightened awareness and kind of brought these conversations into the mainstream. But I think we're seeing a lot of Generation Z really getting that transparency is an absolute necessity in our world. In the workplace, they are demanding pay transparency at incredibly high rates. I saw recently a survey saying that 85% of Gen Zers who are entering the workforce now would not even apply to a job if it didn't include the pay range. So they are part of this kind of revolution we're having right now of that coincides with the pandemic and so many workers saying, like, we've had enough. We cannot be exploited anymore. Employers need to treat us fairly. And a big piece of that is showing us that they're going to do that, showing us that they're going to be transparent and value us. And so I think this transparency movement has brought some of these equal pay conversations into the mainstream and just made it more okay to talk about pay, because we recognize that it's not our fault that we're being paid unfairly, that if we're talking about our pay and calling out the fact that we're not being paid enough, or that we are being paid well and others should be too, those are really empowering conversations for everybody and will hopefully get employers to do the right thing.
Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you giving us some of your time.
Thank you for this conversation.
If you're interested in learning more about the Equal Pay Act of 1963, you can visit today's episode page at jfklibrary.org/JFK35 for more resources. If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet at us at jfklibrary using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening and have a great day.